On behalf of the entire general resonance theory team, I'd like to thank you for being here. Today, we're going to be answering the question, what is the general resonance theory? Presented by Jonathan and Tam Hunt. We now join this talk already in progress.
GRT actually sort of stems back, like a good 10 years. Stemming from conversations that Tam and I had about panpsychism and the way in which the critical issue that has always plagued panpsychism of the binding problem could be resolved. And so the binding problem is this issue where even if we acknowledge that there's some sort of low level proto-consciousness involved in all some level, how do they combine together to produce more, ultimately to produce the conscious experience that we are privileged to have? And that failure to sort of come up with a manner in which these proto-conscious low-level things could combine into higher things is been the perennial stumbling block for panpsychism. And the basic idea that basically Tam and I sort of both were coming to was that some type of resonance could be the glue that ties the individual constituents together to create increasingly more complex conscious experiences. And that furthermore, and this is really sort of the key thing, that the way that the binding takes place is not just a single resonant frequency, but rather a nested hierarchy of resonances upon resonances, hey Jay, upon resonances upon resonances. And so that you basically have sort of building blocks which adhere together into larger building blocks, and larger building blocks. And then critically, the idea is that each one of these successive higher order constituents is itself a conscious entity of a certain sort. And this is pertinent to the other metaphor that I've been working with Justin Riddle, which we've been referring to as nested observer windows, being a bit more speculative about where where consciousness first occurs. So in the nested observer window model, while we recognize the panpsychist going all the way down as being one possible accounting, it's also possible that you could have windows at some levels that aren't actually having subjective experiences, and then through some sort of emergentism experience, consciousness arises at some mid-level or possibly even as high up as the global workspace itself. But the metaphor that still works in both cases, even though there's differences with respect to where consciousness necessarily starts, is that you can kind of imagine what are known as what are they called, mosaic images, where you've probably all seen these, where you've got a image which is itself constituted of smaller images, and then you can imagine those smaller images as of themselves being constituted of pixels of smaller images and smaller images, so that you have these windows upon windows upon windows, where every window is simultaneously an observer itself and also a pixel for the next level up. And sort of the key idea is that these constituent windows are organized through resonance. And so you can actually sort of imagine that these pixels would have as the way in which the composition arises, the synchronization between them. And so that's sort of the basic perspective that I sort of came to the conversations with. And then Tam really did a deep dive in terms of coming up with more elaborated formalizations of the sort of constituent assumptions that are underpinning this kind of perspective, and then also some very specific claims about the manner in which and the conditions under which resonance is generalized or extends between systems. And some of these assumptions seem like they readily lend themselves to testing. Many of them also have to deal with the perennial problem, the other perennial problem that faces all theories of consciousness, which is that it's extraordinarily difficult to know what's conscious and what's not. But the basic approach that we take here is, while acknowledging that it's simply not possible to definitively say what's conscious and what's not, we can nevertheless use a kind of heuristic, which is very much the heuristic that we use in everyday life. Yes. Hey, Tam, you just faded out there briefly.
Yeah, I'm back. Did you hand it off to me?
No, I was just about to.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, so what I was saying is that
resume the recording.
Yeah, it's still recording.
Oh, it went back. Oh, okay, my bad.
Yeah. So in the same way that I infer that you have consciousness by the similarity of your sort of behaviors and reactions to mine, that applies also to why we think that dogs have, I assume most of us think that dogs have consciousness. I think that this little bird cuddling on my shoulder here has consciousness. And so this intuition that we use for inferring consciousness, we think can also be applied to scientific investigations, sort of drawing on the same types of things. So as for example, if you find that across multiple levels of sort of nested integration hubs, that you see very, very similar patterns of information integration from one level to the next, that it's basically a homologous process of information integration from one level to the next level to the next level to the next level, and critically that sort of the processes that of information integration that we see, say, in the global workspace are similar to information integration processes that we see lower down, which are then similar to ones that we see lower down. If we see this very similar kind of information integration process going up and down, then in the same way that we make inferences about each other being conscious, we can start to make inferences about those lower levels being conscious. Alternatively, if we see, at least this is my perspective, this may be one place where Tam and I disagree, because Tam is pretty much, I think, fundamentally wedded to the panpsychist view. But from my perspective, if we see really major qualitative differences in the patterns of information integration, say between the global workspace, the elements that contribute to the global workspace and conscious experience relative to lower level nodes, then that would suggest that there may be something uniquely different associated with that highest level, and be more suggestive of the possibility that consciousness doesn't necessarily go into all the lower levels that we currently posit in GRT that it does. But the exciting premise here then is that by examining various different kinds of resonance patterns up and down the scale, we can begin to make important empirical inferences about the degree to which this notion of sort of nested waves upon waves upon waves represent a stacked, nested, hierarchical set of conscious entities. And it's a really intriguing prospect, I think, that rather than being a singular place of consciousness, that our minds may actually be this sort of remarkable collection of separate conscious streams that get integrated together. It's related to Dennett's multiple drafts theory in a certain sense, but in the multiple drafts theory, he essentially eliminates the idea of any sort of coalescence of consciousness, which he refers to as the Cartesian theater. And in our perspective, it's not just a Cartesian theater, it's a Cartesian multiplex with stacked levels of theaters upon theaters upon theaters. So with that sort of broad metaphorical overview, let me pass it over to Tam.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. That's perfect. And I love, I've never heard you say that phrase before, but the Cartesian multiplex is a really good title for a paper. So let's work on that one in the future.
I love it. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me add a couple high-level comments to kind of key off of Jonathan's introductory comments here. And in terms of our kind of joint development of the theory, like Jonathan said, we came together in discussions over coffee, I think many times in Santa Barbara. And I was coming—
Maybe a few beers.
And a few beers for sure, yeah. And, I was coming from the question mostly from a process philosophy perspective, because I'd spent, a couple of decades, as an amateur philosopher reading through a lot of the literature and not finding any approach that really, satisfied my personal criteria for what made sense. And then I did, maybe 12 or 13 years ago now, I forget when, come across the work of David Ray Griffin and Alfred North Whitehead. And this is, in my view, still the best philosophical foundation for an empirical theory of consciousness. And so GRT is heavily informed by process philosophy, particularly the Griffin version of process philosophy, without being beholden to his particular perspective, because there's some areas we differ on. But I give Griffin a lot of credit for that. And then basically I was looking through the process philosophy lens and trying to figure out this combination / binding problem that Jonathan alluded to. And then Jonathan, as he said, kind of we're talking one day at Java Station in Santa Barbara about, well, what about this idea of resonance? And then that led me down this, rabbit hole to kind of pursuing that idea and developing into a mathematical theory. And so it's been an interesting road, but I guess any theory building, I think, has probably a similar kind of mixed pedigree, where it is obviously very few things that come from, come de novo from nothing. I think all theory making has to have some precedence. So it's been an interesting road. But let me pull up the presentation here. And we're going to tag team today with Nikki Johnson speaking to the experiments. And Marissa Erickson, unfortunately, had a family emergency, a death in the family, so she cannot join us today. But she's been an integral part of the group for the last couple of years also. And Nikki has stepped in to her large shoes in a great manner here. So I'm going to go through a number of slides and Nikki will step in and then I'll wrap up. So we're looking at, how to test for the presence and complexity of consciousness. And we've had a paper published in Perspectives in Psychological Science called "Where is My Consciousness-ometer?" And interestingly, Jonathan, being the senior author in the paper, actually was pushing back a bit on some of the claims that I wrote in the first draft, and he was concerned that we were making a bit too many outlandish claims, even in terms of hypothesis. And a rare thing happened in the review process in this pretty mainstream journal. The editor said, "This seems a bit tame. Can you make it a bit more controversial?" And so we didn't make it more controversial, but it was kind of an interesting message. And I think people are more open to new ideas now, because I think there's been a growing realization in psychology and philosophy and neuroscience that the traditional approaches pursued for a number of decades now aren't really getting us where we go. So I think there's a new openness to new ideas here. So I want to be clear when we're talking about what are we talking about in terms of consciousness. And in this case, we're talking about the basic feeling of experience, subjectivity, the feeling to be something here now. So the famous question Thomas Nagel posed, what is it like to be a bat? And in our approach is, what is it like to be anything? We already went over the development of the theory, so I'll just add very quickly here on this slide that kind of, I guess, the key value add of the GRT approach is the notion that a shared resonance in proximity is a key mechanism for the combination of simple consciousness, or micro-conscious entities, as we call them in our latest paper, into macro consciousness. And I'll flesh this out a bit more, but I want to also acknowledge here some interesting preludes to the GRT approach. I finally got around to reading Koch's amazing book, The Quest for Consciousness. He wrote back in 2004. I read it a couple years ago, cover to cover. And interestingly, he actually has some quotes in here and some approaches that are more aligned with GRT than his current approach, because he's become more of a proponent of IIT, which does not rest on resonance or standing wave theory at all in his current formulation. But here's an interesting quote from Koch in the book. If the input to the brain is more sustained and is boosted by top-down attention, a sort of standing wave or resonance might be created in the network. A powerful coalition of neurons could be assembled in this manner, able to project its influence to the far reaches of the cortex and below. And so this is kind of a nice, retroactive kind of support for the approach we're taking here, where we really do, not quite in a unique manner, but almost unique, look to this key idea of resonance and, a shared resonance in particular for that answer to the combination problem, which, as Jonathan mentioned, has been perceived for some time now as a key problem for panpsychist approaches to consciousness. Now, like most good theories, we want to be clear on our axioms. What is our starting point? And I'll go through these very quickly. We actually went from a nice clean 3-axiom approach to now having 4, and 1A and 1B. I won't really explain why we did that, but it was an important change. So axiom 1A is that all physical entities resonate. This is not controversial. This is, modern physics would agree entirely. There's always some vibration frequency of every, piece of physical stuff in the universe when it's above absolute zero, which of course everything is. Axiom 1B, all physical entities have some accompanying subjectivity. And this is the panpsychism axiom, which is of course so controversial, but much less controversial than it was a decade or two ago. And I haven't seen any, reputable surveys, but my feeling, being in the field now for 15 years, is that, I don't know, maybe as many as 1/4, just as a very rough guess, of working philosophers and possibly even neuroscientists might be inclined to, if not agree with this, not dismiss it out of hand, whereas most would have dismissed it out of hand a decade or two ago. And of course, we're not saying
philosophers are more likely to be on board than the neuroscientists. They're kind of like the bastion of material reductionism.
Agreed. Yeah. And to be clear here, of course, we're not suggesting that an electron or an atom has any kind of complex consciousness. The idea in the version we promote is that these entities have a maximally rudimentary form of subjectivity. So extremely rudimentary. As matter complexifies, so that accompanying subjectivity would also complexify. Axiom 2, the coupling axiom, is that resonating structures in proximity to each other will achieve a shared resonance if the coupling constant is reached or exceeded. And this is basically a consequence of modern oscillatory harmonic theory. And this is formalized mathematically in various formulations. Axiom 3, the nested consciousness axiom, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, is that nested microconscious entities are not extinguished through combination. And this is a pretty key distinction from approaches like IIT, where in IIT, that combination into a larger conscious entity would entail necessarily the extinction or perishing of those lower level conscious entities. In GRT, there is no extinction. There is parallel and nested consciousness. And I'll add also, even in IIT, there is nothing to stop parallel conscious entities in a human, for example, and any causal structures that are implicated in a hierarchical relationship that are integrated over time would entail the extinction of those nested entities, but not the extinction of parallel entities in the brain or in the body. So this leads to 3 core conjectures, and we propose these as a way to make the theory empirically tractable. And we're now, obviously, I'm going to talk about the experiments coming up here. Conjecture 1, the shared resonance conjecture, is again that shared resonance in proximity is what leads to the combination of microconscious entities into macroconscious entities. Conjecture 2, the boundary conjecture, the boundaries of a macroconscious entity depend on the velocity and frequency of the resonance chains connecting its constituents. I'll explain that some more later. Conjecture 3, any biological macroconscious entity will have subsidiary or nested micro and macroconscious entities. That's because by the time we have, biologically complex entities, from vertebrates on up, you're going to have a fairly large hierarchy of organization there. And, one of the key axioms, again, for GRT is that those hierarchies entail necessarily different levels of consciousness. Any questions so far?
Good stuff, Tam.
Thank you. Okay, so shared resonance and a combination problem. So we tongue-in-cheek refer to this as the easy part of the hard problem in a 2019 paper. And Jonathan and I, debated this to some degree of detail as to what was the easy part, what's the hard part. The point, though, was that we could break down the combination problem into kind of 2 parts. One was the basic, underlying philosophical approach. And then the second part would be, well, what does that lead to then in terms of the physical mechanisms for combination? And I want to kind of flesh out quickly why shared resonance in a mechanistic manner will, in our approach, lead to larger scale macro-conscious entities. This is just a schematic, obviously, of 3 oscillators, and an oscillator mathematically is simply something that oscillates, right? So it has some kind of physical structure or information structure, and it has some kind of cycle that it's pursuing as an oscillation. And when these oscillators are out of sync, if the information flows are out of sync, then by definition, they're not going to sync up as well, possibly not at all. So limited or no communication between those structures. If, in contrast, these little rotating, schematic oscillators are in fact in sync perfectly, then the schematic information flow here would be fully synced up, and you'd have far faster and higher bandwidth communication between those 3 oscillators. And if you agree with our axioms that these causal connections, these physical connections entail consciousness in some manner, then it would follow naturally that synchrony of information / causal / energy flows would then lead to higher level consciousness. And this, again, is not a new idea. There's various ways of framing this notion of shared resonance. Dehaene, one of the originators of GNW, global neuronal workspace theory, back in 2014 in a great book, said synchrony facilitates the transmission of information. Pascal Fries has fleshed this out in his own theory of communication through coherence. Paul Nunez and Srinivasan in 2010 paper talked about binding through resonance. So there's various ways of framing this idea. Again, it's not new to GRT. And then Fries in 2017 said also, for effective communication between brain regions, these time periods need to be aligned such that synaptic inputs consistently arrive during periods when postsynaptic neurons are not inhibited. So this has been, fleshed out in the neuroscience context also, not just in a mathematical oscillatory theory context. So I'm going to go briefly here, for lack of time, the heuristic that I sketched out in a 2010 paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies to make it kind of a more mathematical theory. And I'm going to skip this for lack of time, but I want to just kind of focus on this here for a second. One part of quantifying and characterizing consciousness is figuring out what is the physical structure involved in consciousness. And so in this manner, our theory is materialist, but of course, panpsychism and materialism overlap to some degree. And so we're not, proposing an idealist theory where physical structures don't necessarily matter. We agree fully that consciousness is, in its manifest form, associated entirely with physical structures. And so in this case, we developed an approach to actually characterize and quantify the extent of any conscious structure in each moment. And there's other folks that have developed similar ideas. Edelman and Tononi talked about a dynamic core, and they've written books on this, of course, until Tononi branched out and did his own thing with IIT. Koch in a 2019 paper called this the whole, capital W. Stu Hameroff calls this the conscious pilot in a 2010 paper. So the point is that there is a moving structure of activity, whether it's purely EM field activity, neurochemical, electrochemical, et cetera. There is an activity we can track. And under this approach, we can then actually quantify in each moment what is the physical basis for that particular conscious structure. It doesn't have to be contiguous, as in this diagram. It could in fact be, and probably is in many cases, non-contiguous, but it's still connected through those causal links in each snapshot of time. This is the 6-step heuristic fleshed out in that paper I mentioned. So very quickly, we would inductively identify the putative conscious or combination of consciousness, the PCC, so putative combination of consciousness. And this means just based on our everyday experience, you start somewhere in a Bayesian manner. You think, okay, maybe my cat sitting next to me, he's right here, by the way. Maybe he has, a conscious awareness going on. I think it's very likely he does. So we work from that inductive hypothesis. We then look at the primary resonance chains going on in his little brain. And then we identify synchrony indexes, I'll talk about in a second, to do a first step of quantification of those resonance chains. We'd calculate the spatial boundaries in each moment of his EM field dynamics, or whatever dynamics you choose to focus on. You then can calculate the perception index using this formula. This is basically an information theory approach. Similarly, then calculate the connectivity index, which is more of an internal measure of causal linkages. And then you can calculate the omega value through these two terms. So it's meant to be kind of a fairly rough pass, but it can be refined over time to get a more specific and precise estimate of the complexity of that conscious awareness in that PCC. I want to talk quickly about this notion of synchrony indexes. And this is meant to be kind of a shortcut to quantifying both perception and connectivity indexes by looking primarily to electromagnetic field activity using EEG, MEG, and other tools. And synchrony indexes have been around for some time, I think at least 30 years. This is a distinction again from IIT, which doesn't talk about synchrony indexes as a shortcut. They have talked about other measures such as the PCI. I'm actually forgetting right now what the PCI stands for, but it's various ways, of course, you can measure functional connectivity in brains, measuring, blood flows, measuring electric fields, measuring magnetic fields. But the key point with these synchrony indexes is that you can actually use fairly affordable tools like EEG to actually measure the degree of connectivity through synchrony throughout the brain and also the body, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. One of the first synchrony indexes to be used widely is the Lachaud phase locking value, developed in a 1999 paper. And it basically just looks at, assuming that there are, as we know from, 100 years of EEG research, sine wave activity throughout the brain, measurable at the scalp, then looking at different regions of the brain carved up by the number of measurement cells you have, then looking at the synchrony between those cells, you get a rough measure of functional connectivity throughout the brain, and again, also possibly the body. And PLV close to 1 is perfect synchrony, and 0 would be no synchrony. I'm going to skip this slide for lack of time. Let me check, do a little time check here. Okay, so this is a schematic meant to kind of show what we'd get from looking at the perception index and the connectivity index, and then the resulting omega value for different states of human consciousness. And so at the lower left here, for 0 on both, we have death, pretty definitive, pretty easy to quantify, nothing going on. A little above that, we have anesthesia. Nearby, we have deep sleep. For hypersynchrony, but really almost no perception going on, we would have still quite a low omega value, but we would have an epileptic state. And it's on my list to kind of do a deeper dive into hypersynchronistic states like epilepsy, because there's a complex pattern that occurs. I believe during the onset of epileptic states, you have a hypersynchronistic state, but then it kind of dissipates. And I haven't done the research yet to figure out what the phenomenology is for each of those states. On the other end of the scale, you may have a high perception index, but a low connectivity index in, say, psychedelic states. And from what I know of this area, which is admittedly not a huge amount, the science is still a bit in conflict, I think, as to what's actually going on with different psychedelics. So that's still a bit of a question mark also. And then the maximal omega would be flow or peak states, where you have high perception and high connectivity. And then meditation would be somewhere in the middle. So
hey, Tam, can I
go ahead?
Interrupt? Just a point, which is a point and then a question. The point is that while on the one hand I'm not wedded to the notion that consciousness necessarily goes all the way down, I'm also, which sort of makes me more skeptical in a certain way, I'm also not as wedded to the material reductionist notion that consciousness necessarily ends at the point of death, or it requires a brain to exist. I sort of entertain the possibility that consciousness could maintain some sort of phenomenal state beyond death. But what I'm wondering is, when you have death here as being involving 0 on both indices, are you imagining like dead for a long time? So like, for example, quite plausibly at the time of clinical death, there could still be even brain activity as well as phenomenal experience, as in the case of near-death experiences where people have been known to be resuscitated after half an hour, even 45 minutes sometimes.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And again, I don't have deep knowledge of the brain states during the dying process or after, but I do know enough to know that there is some activity. And of course, nowadays we've shifted from an EKG approach to defining death to an EEG approach to defining death. This makes sense to me, but I think probably both are implicated, right? I mean, obviously when you're dead, there's no activity in either the heart or the brain. But I think that crossing over line, it will be actually some omega value. I think it would probably take, I'm just really roughly guessing here, probably, up to a day after death to get to what we characterize as zero omega state. And there are some interesting cases of people coming back from what was, clinically defined as dead, right? So it's not, in this case, death is not actually an obvious red line. It's an arbitrary point using the EEG approach. I actually don't know the exact definition, but I know it's not like well, now they're dead, clearly, and 100% dead. It's like basically, well, at what point do you say they're dead based on their very limited EEG activity? So it's an interesting question. I think in general, the approach with GRT in this formulation would by definition require physical states and activity to be the substrate for consciousness. Going beyond the GRT formulation in its current state, going more into philosophy, I think it's a different discussion, but there's certainly, I think, maybe is some potential for when you look to quantum theory and notions of other structures that may be able to contain information states and various structures. There may be some other ways in which information can be transferred, but I think that's probably beyond what we want to go into today.
Yeah, I know that Stu has argued that their ORC model is potentially consistent with consciousness surviving death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it relies on quantum entanglement, most likely, but I won't go beyond that because I'm not sure of Stu's approach there. Jay, do you want to say anything on that? Do you know what Stu's argument is for OR supporting
after death? He's told me a few times, but I don't I haven't followed. But for what it's worth, there was a guy at the consciousness conference that was studying people after physiological death, which is usually defined as the heart stopping for, I think it's 30 seconds or a minute or something, maybe Maria knows. But they have EEGs on these people at the hospital. And there was this guy that showed that up to like 12 or 15 minutes, you would see high frequency gamma coupling in the brain. So these people have been pronounced dead for like 10 minutes, like 8 to 10 minutes. And as they're past that time, you see more and more gamma coupling specifically. And there's a big question about what's going on here. I mean, the neurochemicals are being dumped by the vesicles. So that's part of the idea, but you do see this crazy high frequency gamma. And after that talk, a lot of people said they took themselves off the donor list. And actually Stuart Hammerall told me he's not on the donor list for that reason.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, just a quick addition there, and you can chime in a second. I mean, this framework would allow you to study that. If you accept the axioms, then you could actually calculate, at least roughly using synchrony indexes, what information is going on in the brain, heart, and interorgan throughout the body, and you'd actually get an omega value there. So this could be, in theory, a better approach for evaluating when someone is actually dead as opposed to maybe sort of dead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess the doctors were hesitant for that because you have to harvest the organs like within 2 to 4 minutes.
Oh,
so there's this big question: if you could prove that someone is somehow conscious or aware in some sense while you're harvesting the organs, you have a whole ethical box that you're opening.
Yeah.
So
yeah, there's a lot of ethical conundrums that come up with this approach. If we agree this is, one way to measure consciousness, it does also affect debates about, vegetarianism and animal suffering, et cetera, because you could, in theory, apply this to almost anything. You could look at, is it ethical to use fruit flies in a lab? How much pain are we causing through that process? But of course, that's meant to be a community-based Bayesian approach over time to figure out, is it worth it?
And then you got plants, which also might have consciousness, and then there's just nothing left to eat.
got to become a breatharian. There's no choice.
Which I'm
Go
working.
ahead.
Roadkill.
Roadkill here, fruit on the ground.
I did want to kind of tune in just about this. I think this is super interesting, Tam, and thank you for sharing. But it's a bit interesting to me. You know, there's a discussion of the nested observer windows, and this kind of idea that there might be these nested hierarchies of resonance, but your plot here with death being kind of at the bottom corner, in some ways I agree with this in the framework of like, okay, the consciousness that's connected to the physical body. But it's almost like your theory of these nested windows stops at the body and saying like, this is the top level of consciousness. But we don't really know that. And is there anything in your theory that would really say that, you know, levels of consciousness are not emerging from interhuman interactions and beyond?
Yeah, well, the GRT theory does actually support suprahuman consciousness, and the combination of entities like humans or even, you know, planets and star systems is really, the approach is based on causal linkage and shared resonance. And so, you know, getting pretty speculative here, I actually am working on an essay looking at whether the sun is conscious, and actually how you quantify, you know, information flows, causal linkages in the sun, and what resulting omega value do you get? You know, so the framework again is meant to be general in that sense that it really can be applied to anything. It becomes an empirical question. You know, what is the actual causal picture you're looking at? And ditto, Maria, on the other end, you know, if we're looking at the human body, this chart is meant to be for human consciousness. But of course, if we do agree that there's some rudimentary awareness in the cells and the molecules and the atoms, those don't cease. Well, the cellular awareness would cease over time also, but it would be a much slower process as the body breaks down. But the molecular and atomic and electronic consciousness continues, of course, no matter what form the body takes.
Also, Maria, I'm actually looking into frequency division multiplexing as the basis for multidimensional subjective conscious experience. So stay tuned.
Okay.
Cool. All right, any more questions or comments? Okay, let's move on here.
Might move meditation higher than flow states, but we can talk about that later.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, these are obviously very speculative and, you know, non-quantified. So yeah, I'd love to hear your feedback on that.
Well, probably like, you know, intermediate versus long term. So you might have some, because, you know, Richie Davison's got all those interesting studies with high gamma synchrony and things like that.
Yeah,
but we can talk about that offline.
Okay, great. So again, you know, just kind of putting some rough numbers to the framework to show how it would work. What you have in the current formulation is basically 0 to 12 for the PI, 0 to 12 for the CI, and that gives, you know, there's also a matching constant in the approach. It gives up to 144 for the top of the scale, essentially. And that's kind of arbitrary, I fully acknowledge. Obviously, you can put different numbers to this, but it's just meant to give you a scale to allow for comparisons across different levels. And so in this, you know, approach, you'd have something like 0.1, for example, for the lowest level of the electron, or whatever we're looking at, a neutron. And then up to 144, whatever we want to call that, you know, with humans somewhere along that scale. And then, you know, potential general AI, certainly higher than humans at some point, but who knows? Might not be around to see that ourselves because it might just kill us off for being lower level life forms. But this is meant to show just how the framework works. Okay, and then an interesting parallel approach here can be found in Wolfgang Klein-Mesch's work. And we had a nice talk from him a few months ago where he talked about this binary hierarchy that he's fleshed out, going from, you know, high gamma at the top down to bold signals for MRI. And he basically fleshes out, I believe in his work, he fleshed out 12 different frequency domains in this binary, meaning a 1-2 hierarchy, 1 to 2 hierarchy. And he acknowledges fully, you can in theory go a lot higher and a lot lower. And again, it's an empirical question. But his approach basically says, look, the way this system works is that there's a natural jostling and resonance to achieve this binary hierarchy as the simplest structure between different rhythms in the body and brain. And, we can look to super fast resonances in, say, microtubules at the terahertz scale. And I did the math one day, and I think it's about 140 different domains to get to that terahertz scale. But, again, in theory, this could be how we have that complete hierarchy fleshed out from the, quantum level in humans up to the highest gamma. And then, of course, you can go as high as you want, down to the bold. You can go as low as you want in terms of, super slow oscillations. I want to speak very quickly about harmonic coupling. This is, the natural integer coupling. It can be 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 4, but a 1 to 2 is the simplest version. And this, as we just saw, is fairly common in the body. And the notion is that this is just a really efficient means of information transfer. And there is some evidence so far, still fairly new as a field, showing that more demanding tasks like arithmetic demonstrate higher harmonic coupling between different oscillations in the brain. And one thing we're planning to do in our work is to flesh this out under different task states. I'm going to skip this. So a few minutes on this new framework we just got published, the MCC framework, the measurable correlates of consciousness. And this is meant to be an elaboration of, how do we build, or I guess even formulate theoretically, a functional consciousnessometer or a psychometer. And we have a really simple taxonomy here, which could be fleshed out, ad infinitum. We start with the notion of measurable correlates, whatever they are. If we want to be scientific, we want to quantify where we can, keeping in mind that quantification always leaves things out, but recognizing that it helps to be able to quantify things that are susceptible to quantification. In this case, we start with the BCC, or behavioral correlates of consciousness, as the beginning of this chain of inference, recognizing that this is what we do every day, 100 times a day when we're dealing with other humans, dealing with pets. We don't know that we're conscious outside our own minds. I don't know that my friends are truly conscious or my cat is conscious, but I assume based on their behavior, and they look like me and act like me in many, many ways, I assume they are conscious. So the idea is that we can actually extend this framework down to not only pets, but also to bats, rats, gnats, bacteria, etc. Look at their behavior. And even things like bacteria and other single-celled organisms, they actually display in some cases pretty complex behavior, like cooperative hunting, that kind of stuff. And so that would be data in this framework for making reasonable inferences about the presence and type of consciousness. Second would be the neural correlates of consciousness, which is, of course, a big focus in recent decades, looking at brain states and mapping them onto phenomenological reports, mapping them onto behavior, and using whatever tools we have to measure neural activity to achieve that quantification of the NCC. And then the third one in this brief taxonomy is the creative correlates of consciousness. And this is, for example, cave paintings left from primitive societies, where we can reasonably infer something about the brain states and consciousness in those beings, presumably humans, that made those cave paintings. And is it reasonable to use artifacts or basically creative products of past cultures? If we discovered a monolith on the moon, could we infer something about the consciousness of that society that created that monolith? Probably we could infer something. So then this framework would be basically a series of questions. I know I'm conscious. That's the basis of this whole approach. The Cartesian cogito. But are you conscious? And then you do a lot of pretty complex, smart things. So I assume you're conscious. And then by that same logic, then what are smart things? And do non-humans display evidence of consciousness? And, dogs and cats and pigs and chimps and dolphins and whales do a lot of really complex stuff, very complex cultures. And that goes down to scale. And there's no obvious, dividing line by which we say this creature does complex stuff where we should infer, conscious activity or not. It's really it's a spectrum. And in the panpsychist approach, by the same logic, you recognize there's always something there, and it complexifies over time. This framework doesn't have to start from a panpsychist axiom. This can start, as I do in this diagram, from the cogito. I am conscious. What do I then use to infer that others are conscious? And then extending that down the chain in a way that, again, is a community-based Bayesian process.
Did anybody just see the translation on the bottom of the screen for panpsychist?
No, what did it say?
Came out as panpsychist. I'm sorry, I'm just wetting myself here.
The
Excuse me.
translation has been consistently amazing. Yes.
Yeah, very entertaining.
I wish I could turn that off, but at last I
Yeah,
can.
you might want to.
Yeah,
Sorry
okay.
about that.
No problem. Okay, so this framework, this is where it is an interesting consequence. There's been a debate for a long time about, are philosophical kind of meta theories, are they inherently merely philosophical, or can they be empirically tractable? And we actually argued in a paper that they are, and this was a debate between Jonathan and myself about the exact language to use. We concluded in the final version that they may be informed by science through this approach. I would go personally a little bit further and say I think they are empirically tractable to some degree under this approach, and it'll be many decades long process of kind of fleshing out these approaches. But the proposed MCC framework is a general testing framework that can transform what have been considered only philosophical questions into scientifically informative ones. Under the proposed approach, broad philosophical frameworks about the nature of mind and its relation to matter, such as emergentist materialism or panpsychism, can also be investigated. And I'm curious, actually, anyone want to share the reaction to this assertion? Do you think it's crazy, or do you think, given the framework I've kind of fleshed out briefly here, does it make sense? Jonathan, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I mean, I think that sort of what I said at the very outset still stands, that in the same way that, as far as I can tell, we may never be able to know, for me to even prove that I'm conscious, that there's going to be quite plausibly a limit to the demonstrability of these analyses. But at the same time, you can begin to sort of gain preponderance of evidence. So if you start seeing, to follow up on one of your things saying before, very complex behavior on the part of bacteria, then that the complexity and the sophistication of the interactions begins to speak to the plausibility of their consciousness, in much the same way that the complexity of my behaviors speaks to my consciousness. So I do think that we can inform our speculations about consciousness in important and meaningful ways. But I also lean towards thinking that these will be areas in which you can really maintain a defensible argument otherwise. I mean, I guess a solipsist would say that they can maintain the defensible argument that the only consciousness in the world is theirs. And logically speaking, I guess that holds, but in some cases, it's just much more compelling than in others.
Yeah, it's pretty lonely philosophy, right? Being a solipsist.
Yeah. the good news is you don't really care what other people think.
In theory. Cool. Well, let's shift to Nikki at this point. Any more questions or comments on this before we go into the experiments?
And maybe I can make a quick comment. Yeah, I feel like from like a qualitative, philosophical, personal level, I think we'll probably develop systems of recognizing consciousness and other systems and biologies. But then, yeah, I just feel like the devil's in the details when it comes to quantifying anything, you know, like these notions of complexity, or, you know, you just add up the strength of functional connectivity between items. It always just ends up sounding really good. And then when you get into on this, I feel like it's always just like a little bit of a letdown, and it doesn't capture that full vibrancy of what you can get from like a qualitative understanding that something is conscious. So I don't know, I'm open to new ideas, but I've just been disappointed by like these just sort of complexity focused solutions.
I was just oh, there he is.
Yeah.
Tam, you looked like you might have been either just really thinking hard about Justin's point or else frozen. It was hard to tell.
More the latter, but I heard your point, Justin. I'll respond very quickly. Yeah, I understand your concern here, and I want to also clarify that the omega value, as with IIT's phi value, is a scalar value. All it is it's just a one point number characterizing what is obviously, you know, massively more complex than one number. IIT does actually have a parallel structure, though, looking at constellation qualia, which I actually write about in the 2020 paper I mentioned as being perfectly complementary and usable in GRT also, which allows for a more complex characterization of conscious states, and it creates these kind of crystal structures in IIT's formulation. So I think that actually may be a nice partnership there. But this is meant to be, in the current formulation of GRT, a rough pass to give you a notion about what level of conscious complexity is present, and then characterizing more fully is a whole nother level of detail.
Yeah, and just to clarify a little bit, yeah, I really appreciate this like multifaceted approach that you're proposing, and that you have sort of the more intuitive, qualitative side represented. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you for that. Cool. Well, then we hand it over to Nikki here. Nikki's going to talk about the conjectures quickly, and then go through some experiments we've fleshed out in our recent work. Go ahead, Nikki.
Sure.
And I'll introduce Nikki briefly. Nikki, you can say a thing or two about yourself.
Yeah. So I spent the first half of my life as a marketer, and then had a profound spiritual awakening, which made me question everything that I knew, and started reading a ton of philosophy and psychology and comparative religious studies and spirituality and science, trying to figure out what was going on with my life. And through that process, just realized, man, there's so much more to the structure of reality than we are traditionally taught, and the working of the human brain, and the two are very closely tied together. So, you know, after reading a ton from all these different areas of nonfiction, today, I would say the sort of driving passion that I have is looking for the neural correlates of transpersonal psychology. So what are the specific changes that take place in the brain, spinal cord, and body to trigger the subjective experience of enlightenment or self-realization? Ambitious, no doubt, but that's where we're at. So I joined the GRT team in August, September remotely last year, October down in Santa Barbara, and it's been fantastic. I mean, when I first ran across GRT, microconscious entities becoming macroconscious entities, I mean, it doesn't get any more transpersonal than that. So very cool, and I've really enjoyed my time on the team. So. Okay. Oh, as we've seen with GRT, plenty of, you know, we've really laid down a very rich theoretical framework. And at this point. It's basically getting down to, okay, let's design some experiments and try and collect some empirical support for these conjectures. So as Tam went over earlier, we've got conjecture 1, the shared resonance conjecture, conjecture 2, the boundary conjecture, and conjecture 3, the nested consciousness conjecture. And since, yeah. Okay, so good place to start would be looking for shared resonance between the brain and other organs. So there's evidence that there's this 20-second or 0.05 hertz rhythm in the gut that shows partial entrainment with the brain's alpha rhythm. So Ribolo and Richter have shown there's this phase amplitude relationship where the phase of the gastric rhythm constrains the amplitude for the alpha rhythm in the brain, which is pretty interesting. You have the eyes, saccadal rhythms, reset cortical and alpha and theta rhythms. Also, cardiac neuron rhythms sync to a number of cortical rhythms. So McCready and Kim and Zhang are listed here, but also I did a presentation a couple of weeks back on heartbeat evoked potentials and kind of looking at, so this amplitude where we can see the signals from the heart going to the brain showing up there. We can see the amplitude and being incorporated in various cognitive, emotional, and self-awareness type processes. And then finally here, so Asa, Tam, and Marissa published a paper which recently came out in Frontiers, I think in February of this year, The Slowest Shared Resonance, a review of electromagnetic field oscillations between central and peripheral nervous systems. So definitely encourage everyone to check that out if you haven't already. So yeah, in terms of the primary neural clusters in the body, there are 87 billion neurons in the brain, but then you've got 210 million in the spinal cord, 500 million in the stomach, in the retina and eye, 100 million, and then in a heart, 40,000. And what's interesting about the heart and the stomach is that these are two locations that have pacemaker cells with the intrinsic ability to depolarize and cause the heart and the stomach to contract. They do this on their own. They are not controlled by the brain. They're regulated by the brain, but this action actually is initiated within the heart and the stomach.
Hey, Nikki, I have a quick question.
Yeah, go for it.
If you could go back to the shared resonance with other organs.
Mm-hmm.
So you cite here like some of these other connections with the gut, with the eyes, rhythms. When we're doing, traditional conventional methods of EEG analysis, and
Yes.
we put a high pass filter or we do an ICA to remove eye artifacts. What is that doing to our ability, the effects that these rhythms are having on the EEG? What is that doing to the data?
This is absolutely the primary challenge that is faced in doing these sorts of studies. For example, with the heartbeat evoked potentials, absolutely. And there was a meta-analysis that was put out talking about just the findings within the field. They found moderate to high, effects coupling between the two. But at the same time, the authors definitely recommended, look, we've got to come up with a standard process for what how artifacts are, rooted out of these, so that we know that it's coming from that versus artifact type stuff. So yeah, definitely.
Let me add there real quick. I did not pose in any way as an EEG expert, but there's a great paper, Ziemenhuner et al. 2020, which goes through in some detail how to ensure you're not looking at artifactual data in EEG studies. But yeah, we'd love your feedback. This is Brian speaking, right? I can't actually see you, but is that Brian?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add, offline, let me know.
Sure. One of the main things that I'm thinking of, and I'm getting into this topic, especially after Nikki, your great breath presentation a few weeks ago. That
right.
really got me thinking in so many directions. Thank you so much.
Cool.
But one of the things I'm thinking about with EEG is like when we do a high pass filter that's like 1 hertz or you know, in that range, how much are we losing these potential slow rhythm effects that facilitate neural excitability? And I just am wondering how much we might be losing in our basic methodological designs for how the whole larger system is coordinating.
Yeah. Alan, I don't know if you want to comment.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah.
Yeah, the answer is that you're losing that information. What's happening is, and you're losing it at a rate of the roll off of the filter, which is going to be roughly probably on the order of 12 dBs per octave. So if you're at 1 hertz high pass filter, then at a half a hertz, you're 12 dB down, and maybe at 0.25 hertz, you're pretty much in the noise. So at that point, you're not seeing anything that would be there, and what would be there would be non-recoverable because you're now operating at either the bit level of the A to D, or you're looking at signals that have been so suppressed that they're beneath the noise floor. So yeah, it's profoundly important actually to if you're looking at EEG's relationship to kind of more core physiologic signals like the peristaltic contraction of the stomach or the movement of the cerebral spinal fluid into the brain, you're missing the vast bulk of that. And the reason for that historically has been because the historical EEG amplifiers have not been good at recording down at low frequency. They historically perform quite poor. And it's only really in the last, I don't know, maybe 15 years or something like that, that the amplifiers have gotten good. And then there have been trends to include also poor electrodes, like a gold cup electrode does not perform well down at low frequency, whereas silver chloride does. And so presently, though, however, if you pay attention to details, it's possible to record EEG signals down to 0.0005 hertz without too much trouble. You need some patience to look at it. But yeah, anyway, to answer your question, there's many octaves of data down there that are presently being missed.
Wow, can I jump in here and make a comment? Yeah, Alan, it's really fascinating to hear that. So if you have like a high performance amplifier, can you just like with a standard net start analyzing those low frequencies? I mean, how interpretable is it, or do you really need like special hardware to record that?
I think most like conventionally available high performance EEG systems are capable of recording at low frequency now, meaning well below a half a hertz. It's just that you do need to pay attention to amplifier design. So like dry electrode technologies are not really suitable for that. Gold cup is really not suitable. So you need to look at designs that are isotonic designs. So silver chloride electrodes, and use gels that are salt balanced to what the scalp is doing. And then you can start to see signals with much higher degree of integrity down at that level.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. I have one more comment on this. So there's been a lot of recent push looking at like the aperiodic signal in EEG research, right? Where you're looking at like the background signal. But one sort of problem with that is that it kind of falls off in the low frequency range. So this sort of canonical, like sort of linear trend that we see within like log space, if you're looking just at like a power spectra, right? It kind of like levels off when you hit the lower frequencies. And there's like one paper by Brad Wojtek's group is doing a lot of this work. But like where the signal like loses a bunch of its power in the low frequency range, that has been associated with like an intrinsic time scale, their words, not mine, like associated with where you're measuring. So yeah, I just wonder like, like a lot of our analysis techniques, we're looking for like these bumps of increased activity, but like in that low frequency range, I just wonder how much these traditional methods like hold up, or maybe I'm overthinking it, and you just kind of just go look and you see clear bands appearing.
Well, it's it's just frequencies, so it's the same. You just the systems just need to be able to support this kind of work, and there's a lot of reasons why historically it's been super problematic to look at that, and algorithmically it's quite complicated because if you're working with IIR filters, like digital IIR filters, and they're running at low frequency, there can be all kinds of reasons why they don't perform well at those levels, and so. You have problems with number of coefficients, and you have big differences between sampling rates and cutoff frequency for filters. So there's just, and also there's just like basic impatience of the researcher. I mean, if you're looking at signals that are 0.0005 hertz, I mean, you're waiting 200 seconds to see something. And so a lot of just not part of it's a little bit outside of the, historical way that EEG researchers have operated. They're looking more at kind of, I mean, if you're busy looking at data in the 0.5 to 35 hertz region or higher, you're gonna have to sort of retrain yourself to think about how you would look at signals that are much lower than that. So I know it's just interesting how much we can tune ourselves to ignore certain things.
For sure.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about, because I know Tam and the crew are thinking about doing a task where they look at these, 20-second per cycle rhythms. So yeah, it's going to be weird to try to fit a more traditional cognitive task into this really slow range. Or this
I think if you look at, like, there are some of these EEG tests, like, what is it, contingent negative variation and like the readiness potential, these kinds of things. These tests are very super low frequency recordings. And so there's been a group of EEG researchers that have been focused in these areas for a long time, but I'm not sure if it's really mainstream or anything.
Great, thank you for that.
Very cool.
We probably should move on in the interest of time.
Yeah, but thank you so much for your input, Alan, and for your questions.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, it's always great having you on these calls, so really appreciate it. Okay, Tam, do you want to flip to the next slide? Okay, right. So in terms of slowest shared resonance, defining coupled neural clusters. So we see with the retina and the brain, 3 to 4 hertz, heart to brain, 0.1 hertz, stomach to brain, which is twice as far, 0.05 hertz, and then spinal cord brain data's not in yet. But so far, as we see, as distance increases, the slowest shared resonance decreases, and this sort of constrains.
And that's the prediction, so far with this very limited data, it's been supported.
Right. So this is some of the work that we can be doing. Yes. But in terms of moving forward, so the Templeton grant application that we put together, and actually discussions that we've been having with Stephen Baumgart at Tank Lab, moving forward with or without funding, kind of been focused on this theme. So are gut feelings real and causally potent? So conducting a series of experiments in which participants undergo simultaneous EEG for the brain, ECG for the heart, EGG for the gut, recordings during several tasks that vary with respect to their cognitive demands and reliance on intuitive or non-reportable information. So the way we potentially see this working, 3 experiments. So experiment 1 will establish whether simultaneous cross-frequency coupling between the brain, stomach, and heart occurs, and if so, if it is moderated by task difficulty or breath modulation. So in this one, we have every of the participants hooked looked up EEG, ECG, EGG, and look at resting state, where we would expect the lowest amount of synchronization versus doing simple arithmetic, where we would expect a higher level of cross-frequency coupling there, particularly in alpha theta range. And then, but the highest level with breath modulation. So this resonant breathing that I covered in that presentation a few weeks back. So, you know, there's a resonant frequency in breathing for every individual. It's unique to that individual, but it tends to be around 6 breath cycles per minute. So 10 seconds per breath cycle, or about 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. But anyway, we'll be, the plan is here, we'll do the experiment with those 3 conditions. So resting state, the simple arithmetic, and resonant breathing, and look for cross-frequency coupling. Okay, with experiment 2, and we'll expand by investigating whether cross-frequency coupling between the brain, stomach, and heart correspond to the efficacy of intuitive judgments. So based on Jonathan's very long history, he pulled out 2 tasks related to sort of looking at intuition. So Bauer and colleagues, they're dyads of triads. So you have a triad of words, so something like manners, table, and tennis. And there's a remote associate between those 3 words, in this case, table. So table manners, table tennis, and what was the other one? Card table or something. Anyway, so you present the participants with 2 sets of words. One has a remote associate, something in common, and the other one does not. And you ask the participants first whether they can recognize what that remote associate is. And then if they're not able to do that, you ask them, well, between the 2, which one do you think has the remote associate? And oftentimes it's been shown that participants are able to guess in some way which one has that remote associate, even if they can't identify what the associate is. So just as one test of sort of intuitive type judgment. And then a second one would be Rensick's change blindness. So you have 2 sets of flickering images. One of them changes. There's something within that image that changes. And then again, very similar to the dyads of triads, you ask the person to identify what the specific change was. And even if they are unable to recognize what that change was, then you ask them, okay, between the 2 images, which one changed? And oftentimes, again, you know, they're able to identify which image, even if they aren't cognizant of what the change was. And then finally, experiment 3 will examine whether breath regulation, so again, this resonant breathing, can enhance intuitive judgments by increasing cross-frequency coupling, thereby providing causal evidence for the nested consciousness conjecture. So basically, that there are signals coming from these organs, the heart and the gut, which may be informing intuitive judgments. And using that as sort of support for the idea that consciousness is stored not just in the brain here, but comes from other places in the body as well. I don't know if Tam or Jonathan want to add anything.
I'll add a little bit real quick.
Okay.
This idea of gut feelings in this particular context was kind of inspired by the work by Robolo and Richter that we mentioned earlier, where it's not just that there's a synchrony, a partial synchrony between gut rhythms and brain rhythms, but actually an entrainment by that slower oscillation from the gut, which makes sense in kind of an evolutionary context. That would be a primary rhythm. But also, of course, the folk psychology idea of gut feelings, and it is a pretty pervasive feeling that there is something that we there is some information being received in certain moments from our body. And so we're like, well, can we test that? And this is actually scientifically, tractable in this framework. Jonathan, you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, once again, I just say that it kind of goes, if the gut is somehow has its own, there's something it's like to be your stomach, then it makes sense that it would sort of participate in the way that we are suggesting. But again, it's still sort of it's probative. That is, it would inform that discussion, but it would hardly prove that the gut is conscious. So that's just sort of the place that we find ourselves in. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it, because if we can build a I can't, there's like some word they use in the law, and maybe Tam knows it, but if you can sort of build a sufficient set of suggestive findings, then it becomes increasingly plausible. And the one other thing I want to mention, just because it does, I think, help to strengthen the intuition for this, is, the chromosotomy patients, the split brain patients, where you see these really different information processing patterns, and in one situation, they're trying to build something. One hand is trying to build something up, and the other hand knocks it down. You almost, and if you ask one hemisphere if they saw something, they say no, and the other hemisphere, they are able to point to the object. These kinds of things are consistent with the idea that we really might have multiple conscious streams going on in our in the skin package we call ourselves. And if the two hemispheres can have potentially independent streams, then why not the heart? Why not the gut? And it is something really informative, I find, if I ask a really difficult question or an ethical question or something like that, I oftentimes just sort of sink into my gut and see what arises. So phenomenally, it kind of feels like you can have almost a discourse with, feel into your heart. It feels like you can have a discourse with these different organs, and this is a potential inroad towards that idea.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
thanks, Ben.
And
Yeah,
sorry, Nikki, sorry, one
go
more comment quickly. We are almost out of time, so I think we'll stop with the experimental discussion at that point in terms of additional slides, but maybe a couple more minutes on questions or feedback on what we've discussed so far from anyone else.
Yeah, could I jump in real quick? Just wanted to validate the idea of I really like the experimental design that you have. That's really cool. I want to just throw a piece in that there's a whole field of from Chinese medicine called Qinate Song, which has which is about essentially internal organ massage and belly massage, and it has a very refined map around location of specific emotional charges related to the guts, related to where such and such is held at some point within the small intestine. And this has been experientially validated by just a whole lineage of practitioners. This is this is something you can get certified in. And I've had.
How do you spell it?
It's Chi, CHI, space NEI, space TSANG. There's a gentleman who lives in Oakland by the name of Gilles Marin, as in Marin County, who wrote some books on it, and he learned from, I believe he's bringing it in from Montauk Chia, who wrote a number of other books on it. So there's, but this is there's there are practitioners all over California for this, and yes, they're like you can press very specific places on your navel and deal with this issue if you're dealing with the right kind of person. So yeah, it's down to that level of specificity just to validate your approach. But
thank you for that.
Cool.
Anyone else?
I have a little comment to make in the sense of being a bit of a skeptic as well, but open to whatever comes out of all this. When there's a somatosensory body map, which is used to basically project the subjective qualities of touch and etc. And wherever that is in the brain for the viscera, could be a region in the central nervous system that is used to project the subjective the gut feeling that we're experiencing. So it suggests to me that one of the things that might become important is an MRI to find those central nervous system regions that correspond to the viscera, so that you can try and distinguish between the remoteness and the localness of the origins of subjectivity in relation to those things. And if that region exists, and I don't actually know where that is, then the idea of introspection becomes a little more palatable, because you can attend to your gut in a way that would then activate things associated with the gut, which could include all sorts of intuitive content. And the brain's just sequestered that region of visceral representation to engage the dynamics associated with that kind of subconscious knowledge, if you like. So I think there's a real story there to engage.
It's a really interesting point, Colin, and thanks for that. I think perhaps what we could do, I mean, the idea is that we can actually correlate the EM field dynamics with this EGG, EKG, EG approach. But I like the idea of including MRI. And
if you can, yeah, it's pretty expensive.
It gets expensive, right? Yeah, probably why the EEG is attractive is it's not that expensive in a relative sense. But yeah, I think you're right that over time we definitely should include those other possibilities to rule out, the things that you're talking about.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends and colleagues, add a comment, and subscribe for additional content. We'll see you next time.